Stand at the threshold for a moment and forget the marble fantasy. Forget the movie image of a lone warrior polishing a sword in some torchlit dungeon before walking out to glory. The real home of a gladiator was stranger than that, harsher than that, and in some ways more human than that. It was not a villa. It was not a barracks in the military sense either. It was a school, a holding place, a workshop for violence, a prison for some men, a career ladder for others, and for thousands across the Roman world, the closest thing they had to home. The year is somewhere in the 1st or 2nd century after Christ. The city might be Rome. It might be Pompeii before Vesuvius buried it. The man inside might be a prisoner of war, a condemned criminal, an enslaved person, a freedman, or a volunteer who sold his body to the arena because he had no better way to live. He is probably young, strong, but not gigantic, scarred, but not ruined, famous to strangers and owned by someone else. And when the crowd was gone, when the sand had settled, when the shouting stopped, he went back not to a family courtyard or a quiet domestic room, but to the place that made him, the Ludus, the gladiator school. Before we step inside, here is how we know what we know. In Pompeii, the large quadriporticus behind the theater was converted into gladiator barracks after the earthquake of 62 AD. Archaeologists found a huge colonnaded quadrangle, reorganized rooms, upstairs quarters probably linked to the manager, and rich parade weapons stored in wooden boxes. In Rome, the Ludus Magnus, built under Domitian, stood just east of the Colosseum and was linked to it by an underground corridor. The remains show a central training arena, housing cells, service areas, and seating for spectators who could watch practice itself as a public spectacle. This is not fantasy set design. These are the excavated bones of gladiator life. And then there are the bodies. Bioarchaeological work on gladiators buried at Ephesus found that many of these men were young adults, mostly in their 20s, and that their bones preserve traces not only of trauma, but of diet. Ancient texts called gladiators barley eaters, and isotope analysis supports a diet heavy in grains and beans. Other evidence points to rigorous training, specialized instructors, and combat that was disciplined and structured, not a random blood frenzy. If we want to understand what a gladiator's daily life really looked like, we do not have to guess in the dark. Archaeology, texts, art, and bone all speak together. Now step inside. The first surprise is how ordinary the room feels when no one is cheering. You expect drama. What you find instead is confinement. A plastered wall, a hard floor, a narrow door, maybe a low lamp burning olive oil and giving off more smoke than comfort, a blanket or bedding roll, a wooden chest if the man owns enough to justify one, leather straps, a tunic, sandals, bandages, a cup, perhaps a token from home, if home still exists for him somewhere beyond these walls. This is not the house of a hero. It is the room of a controlled body, and yet it is not the cell of a death row prisoner either. That is one of the hardest truths to picture correctly. A gladiator lived under discipline, but he was also an investment. Rome did not spend money feeding, training, housing, and medically supporting men just to throw them away at the first opportunity. Some fighters were chained. Some were watched carefully. Some had entered voluntarily under contract and knew the risk. All of them lived in a world where the body had been turned into capital. Their muscles were valuable. Their survival mattered. Their fear mattered too. Before dawn, the Ludus wakes in layers. You do not hear a battle cry. You hear bodies. Someone coughing. Someone clearing his throat. A sandal scraping stone. The quiet slap of bare feet. The clink of metal from a room where helmets and greaves are kept. Somewhere down the corridor, a lamp is opened and the smell of warm oil thickens the air. A guard speaks. A trainer answers. A man who fought 2 days ago rises more slowly than the rest because his shoulder is stiff and the bruise has deepened overnight. Another sits up fast because he is still young enough to think pain is a challenge rather than a warning. He washes the way ordinary Romans washed when luxury was not available, with water from a basin, a splash to the face, a hand over the neck, the chest, the arms. No polished bath scene, no cinematic steam drifting across marble. Not yet. This is the hour before the school fully opens to the day. The skin is cold. The room is stale. The stomach is already awake. Outside, in the central yard or practice arena, the light is beginning to gather on sand and stone. Breakfast does not look like victory. It looks like fuel. A bowl of barley porridge, bread, beans, maybe a little oil, maybe olives, maybe dried fruit when it is available. Not the rich, meat-heavy feast people expect from fighters, but something cheaper, steadier, heavier in grain and legumes. Ancient writers mocked gladiators as hordearii, barley men, and the science from Ephesus points the same way. These fighters ate a diet centered on plant foods, the kind that sustained training and could be provided in bulk. It was not glamorous, it was practical. An arena champion might be celebrated in public, but in the school he still ate like a man whose body had to be maintained economically. Picture the taste: thick, bland, filling, the kind of food that sits in you and keeps you moving. The meal is quick because the day is already spoken for. Around him sit men from different roads of life, now reduced to the same schedule. One may have been captured in war, another may have been born into slavery. Another may once have been free and desperate enough to sign himself over to the arena. A ruined man, a foreigner, a criminal, a born servant, a volunteer. In the outside world, Rome loved to classify people. Inside the Ludus, classification mattered too, but in a different way. Not senator or slave, not citizen or outsider. Here the categories that count are murmillo, thraex, secutor, retiarius. Here the body matters more than the past. When he steps into the training space, you finally understand the architecture of his life. At the Ludus Magnus in Rome, the center was its own miniature arena, a scaled-down echo of the Colosseum, with rows of seating around it. Even training could be watched. Even preparation could become performance. In Pompeii, the converted quadriporticus created a large enclosed world of columns, cells, storage, and circulation around a shared interior space. The gladiator did not simply live near the arena. He lived inside a machine built to produce arena-ready men. The practice begins not with steel, but with repetition. This is another thing the movies get wrong. The first stage is not a frenzy of real blades hacking at one another in the morning sun. It is discipline. Wooden weapons, weighted weapons, blunted weapons. The point is not just to avoid injury, though that matters. The point is to build form, endurance, reflex, economy. A bad fighter flails. A trained one wastes nothing. At the center of that training stands the palace, the wooden post sunk into the ground, about 6 Roman feet high, the silent opponent every gladiator had to face before he faced a breathing man. He strikes it again and again until the shoulder burns and the hand numbs and the motion stops being thought and becomes habit. Listen to the sounds: wood cracking against wood, leather creaking, trainers correcting stance, the short burst of breath that comes with a committed strike. No one swings wildly for long. The doctor, usually a former gladiator, sees it immediately. Keep the shield higher. Do not overreach. Step inside the line. Protect the sword arm. Turn the hip. Recover the feet. Again. 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 Gladiatorial combat was spectacle, yes, but it was also craft. A man who wore a massive shield and heavy helmet did not move like a net fighter. A retiarius had to live by space and timing. A secutor had to close distance under suffocating metal. A thraex used his curved blade differently from a murmillo. Every style carried its own logic, and the school drilled that logic into muscle memory. Now look at the gear, because the gear tells you what the body had to endure. One fighter trains for a helmet that narrows vision and restricts airflow. Another for a large rectangular shield that turns the left arm into a wall and the whole torso into a moving block of defense. Another for speed with lighter equipment, no helmet, a net, a trident, and exposed skin. Roman audiences loved contrast: heavy against light, pursuer against elusive opponent, fish against fisherman. Each pairing was designed not just for violence but for drama. These men were athletes in a theater of asymmetry, but they were not free athletes. That distinction matters. The Ludus was run by a lanista, the manager and owner or overseer of the school. Around him worked instructors, assistants, handlers, and support staff. The Met's summary of gladiator schools makes the point clearly. The school embodied the entirety of gladiator life, not just training, but operations, personnel, scheduling, preparation, and control. And once inside that system, even a volunteer became infames, a person marked by shame in Roman eyes, stripped of ordinary social dignity. A successful fighter might become admired, desired, even famous. But fame did not restore normal status. That contradiction sat at the center of gladiator life every single day. So what did that contradiction feel like from the inside? Probably like living with two selves. In public, you could become a name, a face on painted cups, a favorite of the crowd, the man people bet on. The fighter girls talked about and boys imitated with sticks in the street. In private, you still lived by orders. Your body was inspected. Your meals were measured. Your training was supervised. Your time was not yours. Even your courage belonged partly to the man who rented you out. By midday, the school smells different. The cool dampness of dawn is gone. Now the air is warm with sweat, dust, leather, oil, and the metallic tang that clings to armor fittings. Some men keep training. Others are rubbing down sore limbs, rewrapping hands, drinking water, or eating again. Somewhere nearby, weapons are being checked and repaired. Straps are tightened. Padding is adjusted. The work of a gladiator's home is not only fighting, it is maintenance. The body must be kept useful. The equipment must be kept functional. The institution must keep moving. This is the hour when the humanity of the place becomes easiest to miss if you only stare at the armor. Men talk in the shade. They compare trainers. They complain about drills. They joke because human beings joke almost anywhere, even under ownership. Someone boasts about how he moved in sparring. Someone else says nothing because he knows he looked clumsy and the doctor saw it. A veteran speaks quietly with a novice who still has the frightened stiffness of a man new to the school. The novice asks how loud the amphitheater really is when you step out. The veteran does not answer right away, and perhaps that is the deepest reality of a gladiator's home. It was communal, but it was never safe. You slept among men who might one day fight you. You trained beside men you might later mourn. You learned from men who had survived, and survival itself made them both reassuring and frightening. The room beside yours might hold a future champion, or a man who would be dead by the next set of games. The daily routine created closeness, but the profession planted distance inside that closeness. Friendship lived here. So did calculation. Afternoon training is different from morning drilling. Now the school can shift from isolated movement to controlled confrontation. Not always full contact, not always with real weapons, but enough to test rhythm and nerve. This is where the crowd's fantasy begins to take shape. A retiarius learns how long he can remain patient before the armored man drives him to the edge. A secutor learns how to use pressure instead of panic. Heavy shields collide. Wooden blades slap against guard positions. Feet kick sand. The trainer watches for openings the way a musician hears wrong notes in a practiced piece. And the point, again, is not chaos. The forensic evidence from Ephesus matters here because it pulls us out of myth. The injuries do not look like battlefield slaughter. They support what the written sources say about strict rules, matched opponents, and monitored combat. These men were trained to perform violence within a framework. That does not make their world gentle. It makes it structured, which is somehow colder, not madness, system, not random death, managed danger. When the session ends, the school shifts into recovery. This part is rarely shown, but it may be one of the clearest signs that the Ludus was a home in the functional Roman sense. It contained the daily systems needed to keep life going. The broader gladiatorial district around the Colosseum included armories, support buildings, and even a hospital, the Saniarium. Men were expensive enough that care mattered. Bruises were watched. Cuts were cleaned. Swellings were assessed. A shoulder that had moved badly could ruin a style. A hand that healed wrong could end a career. Some skull injuries at Ephesus had healed before death, proof that at least some men survived earlier trauma and lived long enough for their bones to mend. Imagine the scene in the later afternoon. A fighter sits on a stool while a medic or attendant checks his arm. Another lies back with eyes closed while a poultice cools the side of his neck. Someone drinks a mineral-rich restorative, perhaps the ash-based beverage mentioned in Roman texts and discussed by modern researchers trying to explain the unusual chemistry in gladiator bones. It sounds primitive to us, but then so would much of our medicine to them. The point is that their world did not end at wounds. It organized itself around repair. Then comes the quieter labor, armor cleaned, sweat wiped from the inside of a helmet that already smelled bad before today's session, leather softened with oil, laces replaced, a greave checked for fit, a net untangled, a wooden practice blade leaned back against the wall. This is a home full of objects, but not decorative ones. Almost everything here exists for use, control, or survival. And yet even utility can carry beauty. The parade armor found in Pompeii was richly made. These men did not always appear in the arena as faceless brutes. They could enter as pageant figures, glittering under sunlight, each style of equipment telling the audience what story was about to be played out. That matters because a gladiator's life was built on performance long before the fighting started. The procession mattered, the look mattered, the pairing mattered, the very silhouette of each fighter mattered. You were not just a man with a weapon. You were a type, a role, a readable form. The audience knew what it meant to see a retiarius facing a secutor. They knew how to feel the tension before the first move. And back in the home of the Ludus, that identity was reinforced every day. Your weapon, your drill, your corrections, your bruises, your fear, your posture, all of it shaped you into the kind of fighter Rome expected to see. As evening comes on, the edges of the day soften. The worst heat leaves the stone. Lamps are lit again. Men eat their larger meal. More bread, more beans, more grain, maybe vegetables, maybe some oil, maybe on better days, additions that break the monotony, but not the banquets of the wealthy, not the feasting table of an elite Roman household. A gladiator lived in the orbit of luxury without belonging to it. He performed for rich men, but he ate like maintained labor. And still, food shared at the end of a hard day is never just calories. It is relief. It is routine. It is the brief return of the ordinary in a life built around extraordinary risk. This is when the talk changes. The noise drops. Some men become louder because night loosens what daylight disciplines. Others go inward. A novice may replay every correction from the trainer. A veteran may pretend not to care about the upcoming games and care very much. Somewhere, someone laughs too hard at something that is not that funny because fear needs an exit. Somewhere, someone falls silent at the mention of a name, a date, a city, a match already announced on walls outside. The home of a gladiator was full of anticipation, not abstract, philosophical anticipation. Specific, physical, scheduled, and then there are the nights before a fight. On those nights, even the room feels different. The same walls, the same lamp, the same bedding roll, but everything in the air has sharpened. If he is in Rome, the Colosseum is close enough to matter physically, not just in imagination. The underground corridor once linked the Ludus Magnus directly to the amphitheater. That means the arena was not some far-off destiny he dreamed about. It was next door in the most literal sense. A man could lie down in his room knowing that tomorrow he might walk under the city itself and emerge into a bowl of 50,000 eyes. What does he think about? Not, I suspect, the grand abstractions we place on him. Not empire. Not the glory of Rome, not symbolism. He thinks about the first exchange, about whether his shoulder will hold, about the reach of the other man, about how the sand shifts underfoot, about the blind spots inside his helmet, about how long he can control his breathing once the crowd starts pressing sound into his chest, about whether the trainer's last correction will stay with him when fear hits, about whether tomorrow ends with a palm branch, a wound, mercy, disgrace, or the sudden blankness every gladiator lived beside. But even here, myth needs correction. Gladiatorial combat was dangerous, brutally so, but it was not always a one-way walk to death. Evidence from texts and art and summaries like the Mets make it clear that many defeated fighters were spared. A dead gladiator was a financial loss. A trained one represented money, time, and skill. Sponsors and managers had strong reasons not to waste valuable men casually. Survival was not guaranteed, but it was common enough to shape the entire institution. That is why the school existed. That is why training mattered. That is why repair mattered. These men were not merely sacrificed. They were managed, deployed, and hoped over. So when the lamp burns low and the Ludus finally quiets, the deepest truth of the place comes into focus. A gladiator's home was not home in the warm, domestic sense most of us mean by the word. It was not a family table, not a mother's courtyard, not a child asleep in the next room. It was the institution that replaced those things. A place where the body was fed, trained, corrected, housed, displayed, repaired, and, if fortune held, returned each night to begin again. Home, here, meant the place that kept you alive long enough to be useful tomorrow. And that is why this world feels so close once you strip away the spectacle. Because under the helmets and categories and Roman cruelty, the daily rhythm is recognizable. Waking before light, eating for strength, not pleasure. Repeating hard movements until they become instinct. Living under authority. Sharing space with men you did not choose. Carrying fear quietly. Fixing your tools. Caring for pain. Trying to sleep before an important day. The scale is more brutal. The consequences are sharper. But the structure is human. Intensely human. When people imagine gladiators, they usually imagine the arena. But the arena was only the visible tip of the life. The real transformation happened at home, in the room before dawn, at the practice post, in the bland bowl of barley, in the correction shouted by an old trainer, in the soreness after drills, in the careful cleaning of equipment, in the silence before sleep. That is where the gladiator was made. So the next time you picture one, do not start with the roar of the crowd. Start here instead, in a narrow room lit by a wavering lamp, in a school where men were turned into roles and yet never stopped being men, in the smell of leather, grain, oil, dust, and sweat, in the daily life that stood behind the spectacle. That was the real home of the gladiator. Not glory, not legend, repetition, discipline, hunger, hope, and the long walk from training yard to darkness and back again.